Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We'll just get started in a couple minutes as a couple more people arrive, as is always the case, as people are running from one thing to another. So we'll just wait a couple minutes and then get started. In the meantime, for those of you who are already here, in this webinar format, we actually use the Q&A, not the chat. If you want to introduce yourself just in the Q&A, that's also a great thing. It's always nice to know who's here and to get to meet people, so feel free to do that. Thanks, Mark, for introducing yourself in the Q&A. If anybody else wants to do that, we love to have you introduce yourself. So please go ahead and do that. And I think we'll get started because this is only a 30-minute webinar. So it's a brief one. We don't want to waste too much time. I'm Linda Norris, Senior Specialist for Methodology and Practice at Sites of Conscience. In 30 minutes, I can't promise I'm going to transform your organization, but we'll talk about some ideas about how we might begin that process. As we go along, please put questions in the chat and we'll have time at the end to talk a little bit more. And thank you all for joining. It's always exciting to see both Sites of Conscience members and others joining us in the conversation. Also here is my colleague Cassidy, who's supporting as well. So if you have any technical problems, we can try and resolve them. Just let us know. Next slide, Cassidy, if you would. So many of you know the coalition already. I saw some familiar names when I looked at the registration list, but just in case you don't know who we are, the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience was founded 23 years ago by Ruth Abrams, who's also the founder of the Tenement Museum in New York City. She became interested. She had come to museum work from activism, and she was interested in thinking about whether there were museums around the world also interested in thinking about activism as a part of their work. She sent out like 100 faxes, that's my favorite part of the story somehow, and got a group of 8 or so museums from around the world to respond. They gathered and decided to form what's now the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. From that very small beginning, we are now more than 350 members in 65 countries around the world. And all of our members address so many different kinds of histories, from the legacies of the gulags in Russia to community gentrification in the US and in South Africa, to the legacy of genocidal regimes in Cambodia and Rwanda, to on both sides of the Atlantic, the history and legacies of the transatlantic slave trade. But our members are brought together by really understanding that the past can be used to create a more just future for everyone. And so those incredibly diverse histories in all those places on the map that you see we are brought together by the belief in creating a better future. And if you want to know more about us, you can find our website, sitesofconscience.org. And particularly if you're interested in becoming a member, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. Next slide, Cassidy. So I wanted to think about changing the world, and in doing a little research, I found Jimi Hendrix as a way to help us think about beginning. And he wrote, in order to change the world, you have to get your head together first. And I think what I mean in the context of organizational change here is you personally have to get your head together about the idea of change and about what your role in it might be. But also you as an organization have to get your head together. And that's, I think, we're often stuck at that point in thinking about what it means to get our head together. So we're going to talk today a little bit about 2 ways that might help you do that and some specific small scale suggestions in order to do what Jimmy suggested. Next slide, Cassidy. What's the difference your organization can make in the world? That's called a theory of change. The one I'm showing is from the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History from several years ago. We're so happy at the coalition now to work on staff with Stacy Garcia, who was on staff at MA when this was developed. Many times when museums and historic sites think about the change they're going to make, when you ask you to say, oh, wait, your strategic plan, what's the difference going to be? People are often like, oh, we'll have more visitors. Our collections will be better taken care of. That does not answer a so what question. And the so what question is really about what's the difference your organization can make in the world, not in your museum or in your historic house or in your organization, but in the world. And so, for instance, here, the impact down at the bottom here is that the community of Santa Cruz grows stronger and more connected. So as you're thinking about organizational transformation, you have to look at that big picture part. You have to look at the change you're going to make in the world. One way to help you begin to think about doing that, next slide, Cassidy, is to think about values. Many organizations now have value statements, and every corporation, if you look on their website, they all have value statements. But really, you want to question what your organization's values are. Sometimes there's the values that are explicitly stated, but sometimes they're implicit values. So here's some questions to help you think about values and your work. How do your most important values show up in your work? Do you live your values? In other words, is a way to think about it. How do your organization's values show up in how your organization runs internally? Particularly as we think about diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, DEAI work, to really say, yes, we believe in diversity and inclusion. If your board and staff do not reflect that, you are not living your values. It's not showing up in your work. How do your organization's values show up in what visitors experience at your site? How are more stories included? How are stories included of communities that have been marginalized or left out of your institution or in the larger narratives of history? How have you seen there be a difference in values between the organization and a community? A community might have a set of values that values oral traditions, that values community gathering places. Your organization might value the truth as in a written record, or restricting access to your site in some way. Those are all different kinds of values. I think you want to have the hard conversation about what those values mean and how they're expressed at your organization. Because as you begin to think about transformation, these are at the root of your work, both the explicitly expressed values and the implicit values both. And it's really important as an organization that you begin to question those together. Next slide. So a couple practical tips about what you might be able to do. One, expand your horizons. We often think in a museum and heritage field, which I assume most of you are from, although maybe not all of you. We look at what museums do. We think about museum best practices. That's great, but you also want to think about other ways to do things, to think about work, think about what kind of places are inspiring to you. My colleague Rainey Tisdale taught me about the power of 10 in terms of gathering places, for instance, which is places where people want to be in communities have at least 10 things that you can do there. At a park, you can, play bocce, you can read a book, you can play in the fountain, you can get something to eat, right? Museums aren't as good at, for instance, at thinking about powers of 10, but maybe we should. That's a lesson I learned from people who think about urbanism and creating strong communities. Think about reading, even on your own personal level, reading or watching films that are about things that you know nothing about. Don't resort to the things. Do the easiest thing, read the magazines when you go to the doctor's or the dentist's office. My doctor's and dentist's office have magazines about golf and hunting. That's not neither of those are really my thing, but it's interesting, right? It's a different way to think, and maybe I'm going to learn something there. So expanding your horizons in your own community, which also means going to somewhere different in your own community that you don't go to, and in the way you think about the world, both of those are critical. When I think about my sites of conscience work, the ability to work with organizations around the world is incredible at this particular aspect. Next slide. Celebrate and learn from failure. Our dear colleague, Sean Kelly from Eastern State Penitentiary has run this session for a number of years at AAM. It's called, I think it's still called, Mistakes Were Made. And in it, it's always standing room only. People stand up in front of all of their peers at the American Alliance of Museums conference and talk about their biggest fail. I've done it myself. And then at each table, there's a competition to tell the best failure story. And then the table winners go up front and tell their failure stories. There's a lot of failure in this room, lots of failure. And sometimes you think, whoa, sometimes you hear stories and you're like, that was a really big failure. We are always learning from failure. And it's important to kind of celebrate that learning. What Sean does in this really tremendous session is get us all to think that we have things we can learn from each other, but also about ourselves. And so again, as an organization, you're never going to create change without celebrating and learning from failure. Next slide. Often we talk about, being boxed in by money or space or time or all of the other constraints that exist in all of our lives. It's really helpful to think about those constraints as creative constraints, not things that we have to live within. This is an image, actually, I took a couple of years ago at the Gardner Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. And they had a visiting artist who was a graphic novelist, I think is what he did. And I was so intrigued by his 3 little cases of big pens that he had there that I asked about them. And he said, oh, when I was growing up, I grew up in a rural community in Texas, I think. When I was growing up, these were the only things I could afford for my artwork, were these really, 29-cent big pens or whatever they were then. And he goes, so I still use them to challenge myself about how creative I can be within the constraint of these big pens. So whether it's, can you do an exhibit for $100? Whether it's, you have this tiny space, what is it you're going to do? understanding, pushing your organization towards change by viewing the constraints you have as something to be creative about, not something to throw up your hands in despair about. And those are all, they exist for all, constraints exist for all of us. None of us live in a world of unlimited time and money and every other resource. So beginning to reframe the way you think about them is going to help you work towards organizational change. Next slide. And thinking about those constraints also means the idea that ideas, sometimes an idea comes up and it's just not the right time. Rather than shooting it down, create a shared idea file together with your colleagues, where ideas that might seem not great at the time, but might be really useful somewhere forward as you think about organizational change and as you change as an organization. And I've used Abraham Lincoln's hat here because apparently Abraham Lincoln used his hat as an idea file, and he kept drafts of his speeches and ideas for speeches in his hat. So whether you're going to have a hat as an idea file or a Google Drive folder, begin to have places where ideas, those things that come from expanding your horizons, can live and be shared with your colleagues. Next slide. Thomas Edison. We often have ideas that organizational transformation has to be big and massive, and like one day we're one thing and the next day we're something else. I think about that kind of a transformation. I was recently in Senegal, and Senegal has a relatively new airport, and somehow they managed to, in a single day, go from having planes land at the old airport to having planes land at the new airport 50 miles away in a single day. I can't figure out how they did that. And they did do it, evidently. But I don't suggest that for any of you. So Thomas Edison, possibly an apocryphal story, when someone said, so how does it feel to have tried 500 things to find the filament to make a light bulb work? And Edison supposedly said, no, I have learned 500 things. So as you think about change at your institution, and I think this is particularly important if you're not necessarily the leader or the director of your institution, if you're somewhere in the middle, reframe your projects, the change you want to make, as experiments, and set expectations accordingly. It's a lot easier for someone to say yes if you have a new idea that's about change and about transformation, and you say it's just a pilot, we're just going to try it out, rather than this is going to change everything. So reframing the way you describe the change you want to make as experiments, as pilots, as prototypes. There's lots of words to use around that, and that helps set expectations for yourself, because no new idea goes perfectly the first time, but also for the people you work with, that they don't expect. And then, of course, to go back to celebrating failure and learning. This is a part of a cyclical process where all together you begin to kind of begin to personally, as an organization, develop your change-making muscles about how you're going to do this and what you learn, how you can have creative constraints and really build upon them so that change can really happen. Next slide. It's really important to think about and to understand that nobody makes change in an organization alone. And this is a photo from just last week, I guess, at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. The coalition, my colleague Braden, who's in the back there, and folks from 3PV, another consulting firm, worked with what was called a cohort of the willing at the National Gallery of Art to think about making significant internal and external change. This cohort of 40 or so people, this is the first time in 2 years we saw them in person, worked together, meeting once a month and doing lots of other things for 2 years to try and think about change at a big, complicated institution, as you might guess the National Gallery is. And it was so clear as we asked people to reflect on their experience over the 2 years, the process of doing it together was vital. The support each of them showed each other at every level and from every department at the institution. And so whether you're from a big place like the National Gallery or the National Park Service, I saw a number of people here from there, or you're from a tiny place where the alone is like the 3 of you at your institution. You can't make organizational change alone. You always have to do it in collaboration with your colleagues, with your board of directors, and with your community. When I look at this picture, part of what I see is what that joy of not doing it alone can kind of bring. So, nobody does it alone. Next slide. And you always have to be thinking towards the future. I want to remind you all to go back to that. So what's the change that we want our organization to make in the world? What is that change? What could it be? How can we get there? And always be evaluating it along the way. Next slide. I just wanted to share a couple books that I have found useful, and I apologize for this shameless self-promotion of creativity and museum practice, but some other ones, both old and new, that I think are really great. Mike Murawski's new book, Museums as Agents of Change, Nina Simon's The Art of Relevance, which I continue to find useful and important in my own work, Transforming Inclusion in Museums, Portia Moore, Rose Paquette, and Alethea Whitman. There's lots of great writing about institutional change, both in museums and heritage sites and elsewhere out there. I encourage you to kind of find them. I also find kind of interesting reading in blogs and elsewhere, but these are useful practical tools that can be used all along the way. Next slide. Questions, anybody in the Q&A? I've gone pretty fast through this, but questions, specific issues you're facing, please put it in the Q&A. I'd love to hear about specific problems or challenges that you're facing in your own institution that you're kind of like, I don't know how to get over this bump, whatever that bump is. And so in the meantime, while you're thinking, because I hope you're thinking about what to write, we're going to pop up a quick poll about the webinar to give you a chance to answer that. But I also hope that you'll come back to the chat room. Thanks, Cassidy, if you'll put the poll up. Answering the polls is super useful in helping us plan future webinars, as we do lots of them and we really want them to be useful to you. Can you elaborate on creative constraints when things are out of your control? I think that is a creative constraint about things we don't have control of. Let's see. I'm trying to think of a specific example. So you don't have control of, say, a long time ago in my career, I was a very, very young director at a historic house. And I was the first director. So they had a lot to get used to. I had a lot to get used to. I had a board member who believed that there should be like 20 chairs in every room in the historic house, like you made the bedrooms into an auditorium. I didn't have control of what that house physically looked like, but I did have control about, and that was a constraint. It's like, wow, there's a lot of chairs in this room, which I know is like kind of a dumb example, but it's the one I have. But I did have control about how I trained the guides. And so we began making change by shifting up what guides said on the tours, which the board member who really cared about chairs didn't care about that. He cared about the change. And so I think saying, oh, what's the way? I think part of it is figuring out how to go around to a different way, if that makes sense, anonymous attendee, for kind of thinking about that. It's like, there's a lot of different ways into a problem. And that's part of what's nice about having allies in this work, because sometimes they can help you see a different way. How might I help entry-level and emerging professionals change their mindset and feel like they can make change? I think that's a really interesting question in a broad way about graduate programs and the other kinds of training we get. I think, Mark, you can probably encourage that small scale experimentation and give entry-level and emerging professionals some space to kind of experiment in a low stakes kind of way, because that, as I said, begins to build your creative muscle. So in terms of helping entry-level people, it's like giving them permission almost and encouragement to say, oh, how, try this thing. What's the different way we can think about this? An example, actually, after Creativity and Museum Practice came out, we heard from somebody who was headed up a collections department in a pretty big institution. And he was having his staff read the book. And one of his staff members, who was worked in digitizing things, came to him and said, I figured out a way that we can speed up digitizing by 10 seconds or whatever per image. And, for those of you who digitize collections, over time, those 10 seconds are a lot. And so he really, so the head of collections said, well, let's try that. And so I think it's really about, Mark, finding spaces for them to build their own strengths and supporting them in that process. And also then helping them understand that they'll not be punished for failure, but that every failure is kind of a learning experience. Any other questions? Comments, things you wish I addressed or that you want to know more about? We send a follow-up email that you'll get from this with some of the resources listed. So you'll be able to find out more. And just a couple reminders of things coming up. We have 2 webinars coming up in July. One about gentrification with staff from the National Public Housing Museum in Chicago, whose work is incredibly interesting and fascinating. And the one about starting a walking tour with colleagues. I'll be facilitating that one with different colleagues who do walking tours in different kinds of places, both urban and rural. So those are coming up. You don't want to miss those. They continue to be good. A reminder that all our webinars are recorded, so you can always find them online from our website as well. This is a 30-minute webinar, and I am just about there unless anybody has any other questions. Next slide, Cassidy, so we ensure that people know where to find us. Yeah, so we also encourage you to find us on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. It's a great way to find out about what we're up to, what our members are up to. So please find us there as well. And I think that's it, unless there are any other questions. Thank you all for coming.